Thanks, everybody. Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Ricky Camilleri. The American immigrant experience has long been mythologized, unfortunately politicized quite often lately, but rarely are the small experiences, the minor triumphs, falling in and out of love, getting the job you want, or finding true personal freedom in a new land explored. The new show, Little America, rectifies that completely by giving us 8 true-to-life stories about the immigrant experience. They are intimate, personal, and always beautiful. Please welcome the show's creators and producers, Lee Eisenberg, Joshua Bierman, Alan Yang, Emily V. Gordon, and Kumail Nanjiani. Let's hear it. Hi.
Hello.
I like what you were trying to do there. I'm like, good job. You're bouncing around. Yeah. So let's go back to the beginning. How did this start? Where did the idea come from to find these stories and to tell them? Who?
Hello.
Hello.
This started. I was in my office and desperate for money. No, I was trying to figure out what to do next. I was really just as a writer.
It was a great place to start.
Yeah, I always start with money and kind of work backwards. Yeah. No, I was trying to think about what I want to write next and produce next, and what was exciting me and what I was interested in watching as a viewer. And I was thinking a lot about Master of None, and there's an episode in the first season called Parents that was a story about these two parents coming over to the United States and the relationship with their kids. And people talked a lot about the episode. I loved it, and I thought, what if every episode of a TV show was like that? And that's really all I had. And then the first call I made was to Josh, who was pointed at, and who founded Epic Magazine. And he said, oh, we've been looking to do first-person photo essays. What if we did them about different immigrant stories? And so for months, we just started collecting these stories. And then the next calls were to everyone in the front row. And I was saying earlier today, it's when you start putting together a project, you kind of have your dream team. You're like, well, I know I'm not going to get my first choice for the actor. The director's not going to be the person I want. And for this, every single person I wanted, the first people that I talked to were the people that are right in front of you. And we just started talking about what the show would feel like and kind of went from there.
Were there any ground rules for the stories that you wanted to tell? Because one of the things that I loved about the 8 episodes is that they always avoided the cliche. Be it the sort of heartwarming cliche or even the negative cliche of the experience. How did you enforce those or come up with those?
I think we just wanted a variety of tones and experiences. We kind of wanted to make sure we're representing all the emotions we possibly could. And I think we did kind of want to avoid the super mega happy ending or the mega sad ending. We kind of wanted it to be what life is, which is human. And sometimes your best ending is not always it's gonna have some tinges of darkness to it too. So, but we wanted episodes that were romantic, ones that were funny, ones that were serious. We just wanted a breadth of experience.
But there was a sentence that we said no
right.
character would say in the show, which was, back in my country,
Correct.
we decided that nobody ever would say that because people don't talk like that wherever they're from. And yeah, I mean, I think the best we could do, because there is no one immigrant experience, so the best we could do is just show all the different kinds of stories and tones and convey that there is no one immigrant experience. Because as you said in your intro, I feel like no matter what side of the immigration debate you're on, people get a similar image in their head when they hear the word immigrants, and we wanted to blow that up a little bit.
Oftentimes, for better or worse, that image can stem from some sort of truth and somewhere. I mean, cliches exist for a reason. If you came across stories that had those elements in it, was there a sense of like, this story has been told, or this wouldn't necessarily fit into what we're trying to say about the experience within the context of this show?
We just wanted to tell stories that we hadn't seen before in the context of people who'd moved to America, right?
Yeah, maybe you'd seen a sports story before, but you haven't seen like a young, one Mexican woman as the hero of a sports story. So that's worth telling. Yeah.
Alan, when did you get involved? I mean, you were one of the writers of the Master of None episode that he was referring to, right?
Yeah, that episode is about my dad's life and Aziz's dad's life. So, Lee called me pretty early on, and he mentioned that episode, and it was actually really great timing because the idea he pitched to me, an anthology show where every episode is a different immigrant story, was incredibly exciting, number one. And number two was really kind of in the vein of an episode that I had directed for season 2 of Master of None called New York, I Love You. And in that episode, we kind of start with the main characters of the show, and almost immediately we start following someone who was previously in the background of the episode. and then we follow their life, and then we follow someone else's life. So in that episode, you're following 3 sort of interconnected stories of people who used to be in the background of stories, essentially people who were, underrepresented in the past. And so tonally and sort of thematically and conceptually, that episode was almost like a backdoor pilot for this show. So, we showed that episode to Lee, and I think he really responded to it. And so early on, like I just really thought it was a great idea and had a lot of legs.
How does a writer's room for a show like this work, where each episode is a completely different story, and you're working from somebody's real story?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we did in the first season is, as much as possible for the writers and the directors, we tried hiring people from the countries of origin. So Ugandan writer wrote the Ugandan episode, a Nigerian writer co-wrote the Nigerian episode, Persian director directed the Iranian episode. As much as we could, but me and Kumail and Emily wrote the Iranian episode. I think we wanted authenticity more than anything. And if it wasn't someone from the country of origin, we did a ton of research. We'd also re-interview the subjects. So go back to them as we're kind of developing the story in the writer's room. We would go back to them and say, well, how did you feel in this moment? Because I think sometimes it's almost like you're playing therapist, and as storytellers, you're trying to pull out the emotional truth of someone's life. I don't know for sure that everyone speaks in the way that writers speak when they talk about story and talk about character and growth or arcs. And so you're kind of looking at these moments from someone's life and trying to pull that out of them a little bit.
Would you say you're trying to work away from the plot points, so you're not just solely focused on the plot beats that happen within the story?
I think that this is a show that isn't. Look, it takes forever to to break one of the stories and to get it right. Some shows really are heavily plot forward. I don't think that the show is that. I think if the show works, it's because in a half hour you find yourself invested in a character that perhaps you've never seen before or thought about. There's a lot of care with that. But at the same time, we were careful. The episodes are inspired by true stories. That they're not biopics. These are not documentaries where it's a moment-by-moment accounting of someone's life. More than anything, we want to get the essence and the truth of what they were experiencing during that time.
So the Iranian episode that you were just referring to, I feel like it's the closest the show comes to a character saying "back in my country," but you subvert it in a way by having his wife say it and by have all of his actions sort of committed to that idea, rather than the main character consistently saying that. Did you talk about that in the writers' room with that?
Well, there was a point in that where, the realtor is helping him find a house, and she says, we'll get you a better house than you had in Iran. And he says, I didn't have a bad life in Iran. I just came here because I wanted a different life. A lot of times you see this narrative that people are escaping from the country of origin, which is very true for a lot of cases, and it's true in some of the stories we tell as well. But in that specific story, we really wanted to show another side, which is people aren't always. Yeah, he's a hustler. He's he wanted more opportunities, so he came to America. It's not that his life was bad in Iran. So yeah, we try and subvert that a little bit in that.
I think also with that episode, I'm also thinking about the Syrian episode. Where the main character has to flee his house after his father discovers that he's gay. We wanted the show to be complicated. There's no easy answers. It's not like Iran is bad, the U.S. is good, Islam is bad, America is good. That's not
just that little thing is going to be viral now. So you've really
did I do it?
Yeah,
you get it.
You've messed it up.
No,
please crop me out of the GIF.
The rest of the answers are going to go like this.
Expand on that a little bit more, and again, lean into Kumail what he said.
No, but I think that we really made a point in all of the episodes that it's not clear cut, and he has a really complicated relationship with his family. And even though his father chased him away and tried to kill him, that he misses his father and he misses his brother, and he sees on Facebook that he's now an uncle, and those are complicated feelings, and it's not as simple as. There's no black and white. It's all in the gray. And it was really important for us to hit that.
And also that the father isn't evil. The father is trying to save his son from what he thinks is going to be an eternity of torment.
And he misses his son too.
He misses his son too. Yeah. The best bad guys are when there are no real bad guys. Everybody has their own motivations.
I was curious about that show because, or that episode, excuse me, because often I think people would relish in the negative of that episode. They would show more and more how oppressive the father was, how abusive the father was, and how oppressive the society was. And again, it seems like a mastery of tone within the entirety of the show that within that episode, you guys know how to not do that.
Well, I mean,
touch on it here and there.
We should credit the writers of that episode, Amru Al-Qadi and Stephen Dunn. They really, really poured themselves into it, and the actors, Adam and Haas, who portray the leads, really, really brought their own experiences to that show, and in to varying degrees, that all had experiences similar to that. So they'd understood that. As Emily's saying, it's not black or white. You know, it's not really relishing in the negative. There is. It's complicated.
Yeah.
And that was also Shadi's experience, the subject of the story. And you asked about the writer's room, and it was true. It was interesting. A lot of times the emotional complexity of the story would get unlocked going back to the subject. In that case, that happened here. When we heard that, we thought, oh, that is different, in fact, than our expectation. And let's work that into the story and make it more complicated.
What was the hardest story to beat out, to tell, that maybe gave you the most fear in terms of executing?
I don't know which one's hard, but an interesting one, I think, is the first one, which is about the Indian kid whose parents got deported. I think that one's really interesting because a traditional story for TV movies is there's a character, they have an obstacle, they learn to defeat the obstacle while learning something about themselves, you know? Well, in that one, you're up against the immigration system, and that's an obstacle you cannot defeat. It's an immovable rock, and so...
Like The Rock.
Yeah.
In that episode.
Right. So that one was an interesting episode because...
Well, even because he's also... Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No,
excuse
go
me,
ahead.
but he's also given his moment where in most narratives, it would come
Right.
for him, right? He gets to the top of the mountain.
What a bonkers thing, right?
Yeah, and it's like, nah.
And that's as Josh was saying. I mean, that's all based in the truth of what happened, you know?
Yeah.
That one's also interesting because there's sort of a funny hook to it, right? There's a kid running a motel, so at first we thought, oh, this is kind of a funny,
Home Alone.
lovely home. It's like
I
Home
remember
Alone.
we said Home Alone as we
You know,
discussed that
yeah,
episode.
If you watch that
Planes.
episode, it doesn't quite feel like maybe Home Alone 2, but not
Lost
like
in New
the
York?
original.
The
No.
part where Donald Trump comes in, it feels like that.
Matt, I was waiting for booby traps, and none of them showed up. It was a
Paint can to swing down. Yeah.
But then it lands in this really melancholy place at the end, which is also true to the experience of Kabir's, Kunal's originally. I always have them mixed up because
We will do that a lot. We change the names, yeah.
We have them all in mind as we've developed it over the years. But his parents went away, and by the time they came back, they realized, like, well, we don't really know each other anymore. And it sort of ends on that note, which is a very different note than where it starts.
Well, it's subverting what we expect from that because we would expect the parents come home and it's just a celebration and everything would be melancholy and sad before that without them there. But it's actually a somewhat lighthearted tone up until that final downbeat, which is somewhat, it just feels truthful. Like you said, it's what you're going for.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that we kept, finding out with these stories is when you have those true stories and you've done the research and the people at Epic Magazine did such a great job doing that, sometimes the reality just gives you this texture that your pure imagination won't always lead you to. Because I think after years of writing stories and crafting arcs, as Lee mentioned, you have this tendency as writers to want to tie things up, to have things dovetail, to have there be a neat narrative arc. But I think what happened with this show is it feels emotionally truthful sometimes because the real stories poke through and give you those details and give you those unexpected changes in the story that you might not come up with on your own. And again, want to reiterate that they're not necessarily documentaries, they're not beat for beat
Right.
stories, but sometimes he enters the spelling bee and he meets Laura Bush, but it doesn't do anything. That's interesting because if you were to write that in the movie, it would do something.
Would have otherwise well, cut that scene if it's not doing anything.
Yeah,
We gotta cut that
exactly.
scene.
There's an episode called The Cowboy about this, him. This-
Love that episode. I mean, I like all
yeah,
of them, but I love that.
and it's
actor.
interesting. It's this guy from Nigeria, and he decides he wants to be a cowboy. And there's a moment when he walks in, and you think everyone's gonna in class look at him and be like, "Oh wow, he's so different now," and nobody notices. And again, that's going back to his initial experience. He thought, "Oh, I'm gonna change what I look like. I'm gonna be a Nigerian cowboy, and people are gonna have a reaction to it." And people did really have a reaction to it.
People are very self-absorbed. It's hard for anyone to ever notice anyone else.
There's a great reaction shot in that episode when he walks in as the cowboy, and there's just an extra who just kind of just looks about 2 seconds and just looks back and just goes back to his
I
schoolwork.
felt that in my
And I was
core
just
when
like,
that
wow,
happened.
what a great
Yeah.
performance.
That's exactly
by
what would
someone
happen.
with no lines.
Did 30 takes of that.
Tom McCarthy is also in that episode. And
Yes.
he's
Yes.
wonderful in that episode. Can you talk about that character and casting him? Because there's a great narrative hook with him where you're not sure where he's coming from and how he's reading the situation, and he almost begrudgingly becomes an ally in a way. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I actually didn't realize it was him until we got to the set, and then it's like, wait a second, I think that's a famous director right there. And then I had all these questions
Spotlight.
about Spotlight. I was like, wait a second, did you know at the end? And then we basically spent a lot of time talking about that. And then that character actually is sort of one of the things that is kind of fictionalized. He had a professor that Igwe, the subject, had this experience with, and we just, it was one of those exact examples where we thought, like, well, this guy's not listening and he's not paying attention to our hero, and then he's going to like slightly modulate his feeling. It's not going to like come all the way around and be a glorious future, but it's going to be sort of like a subtle shift, and that's all he can hope for now that he has like a sense of himself. And I think McCarthy, just as a great director, like understood how to play that. He plays a pretty good villainous professor at the same time, but also knew how to like make it subtle.
He corrects it in a very subtle way. I want to go back to something that you were saying a minute ago about finding the truth within these stories and sort of avoiding the cliche. And you had said something about if it was Laura, you have a scene with Laura Bush, then why is that there if she's not solving the problem or it's the hero moment? When you're in the writer's room and you're beating these out, I know you have the true stories and sometimes you fictionalize a little bit. Do you have to get through those ideas that kind of come because your taught narrative has to be this way before you get to the truthful ones and the ones that feel real? Or do you find that organically, naturally, you don't even hit those surface ones?
I mean, in the writer's room, you're exploring every single one of those avenues. And so, again, we start from truth and we start from honesty, but there's so many different ways you can go, and we're now working on season 2, and you put up all these index cards, and there's 20 or 30 index cards and some on the side that you've said, oh, those aren't going to work, and then those get put back in. You start rearranging it, and you're trying to create an emotional build, both for the viewer and for the character. And so, going back to the Indian episode, that Laura Bush scene is everything because it's exactly what the audience expects. Like in every other thing, somebody reads the rousing speech, the music comes up, it swells, and then Laura Bush says, "Come talk to me afterwards," and then things start working out. In that episode, it's all about time. So having scenes that don't do anything is exactly the point of it, because there's nothing that you can do in that situation to solve it aside from waiting it out and hoping that it works out.
And I think Sherilyn Fenn's performance as Laura Bush is very good, and she has actually a lot of compassion. The obvious thing would have been to portray someone who doesn't help the protagonist as being sort of cold or disinterested, and that's not what her performance is. I sort of understand her position too, which is I can't just help this one kid's parents come into the country, because then what kind of precedent does that set? So I thought that her performance was really, really very, very textured.
She's also the first lady in 2003 or 2004 when it took place, right?
Yeah.
Which is like a fairly powerless role within the
that
government.
Is absolutely right. Yeah, she was there for a spelling bee thing. Yeah, she wasn't like, I'm not here to like help anybody with immigration issues. I'm here for a
Go to
spelling bee.
INS. Like, I
Yeah,
don't think
exactly.
We cut down that scene a little bit, but as I recall in the writing of it, it was like, oh, and where are you from? And it's just, and what was the word that it was all that kind of stuff. And then it comes to him, and he kind of blurts out. He has a lot more to say than the other kids, but the whole scene was supposed to be kind of very pleasant up until that point.
It's just this idea that I feel like growing up watching TV, growing up watching movies, we are taught inadvertently how a story should go, because most of us don't grow up watching art films. We find them when we're like 20. We grow up
That's
watching
right.
like bad movies, and so when you start working on things, you're like, oh, it's got to happen like this because that's how movies go. And if you're making something that subverts all those expectations, it must be kind of difficult at times to sort of put away everything you were taught.
Yeah, and it is interesting, as Josh was saying, you always have the truth to go back to, and as Alan was saying, the truth doesn't always have like a little bow at the end. What also helped us is that a lot of the writers we used weren't traditional TV writers' room writers. We had playwrights and people like that who weren't sort of schooled in those rhythms. I feel like sometimes when people are in TV writers' rooms specifically for a long time, those patterns become how they write. And that's how we receive stories too. There's nothing wrong with those patterns, but it was interesting to have people from different backgrounds write these scripts.
Yeah, and to build on your point, not just movies, but specifically the half-hour form, which is what we're working in. You really haven't seen that many examples of the half-hour form being really, really challenging. There've been more and more in recent years, but certainly when we were growing up, Family Ties wasn't doing that. It was like, it just wasn't happening.
It's all the hug and learn.
Do not
hug and learn.
diss on Family Ties.
That's my vendetta. No, I mean, I'm a Mr. Belvedere man.
Every interview, you just go after Family Ties when you get.
I hear these
How
two
dare
argue
you.
about these two shows.
It's also like I also didn't watch Family Ties. It's like a little bit before my time, so I don't know why I picked that as an example.
So young, so young.
One of the episodes is written and directed by the person who the story is about. Can you talk about making that happen, allowing that to happen, recognizing
That's
that
a
this
great
person
story.
can tell the story?
Yeah, Josh, you want to handle that? Because you met with him, right? Or someone you're at
yeah,
Epic.
we-
Arthur,
we-
maybe,
yeah,
right?
We were meeting with Z about, he's a director and coming to
Chun.
direct one of the other episodes, and then he just started talking about his own family experience and growing up with his mother as a single mom and how she always wanted to take them on vacation but couldn't afford it, and so then she went to the vacation expo and put cards in until she won a vacation, and then when they go on vacation,
But there's one small thing. There was a blizzard in Boston. So she went to the vacation expo, and all the people that
was
worked the
nobody
vacation
there.
expo were there, but there was actually no crowds.
Yeah.
So she ended up actually, in real life, I think she won 3 trips.
Yeah.
Because there was no one else sticking their cards in the raffle boxes.
and then ironically the trip was an Alaskan cruise, so they're escaping the blizzard to go to Alaska, but then they get on the boat and the kids are getting into their teenage years and don't want to hang out with their mom, so there's this terrible irony, and also just what that represented for them as a family. We're like, that's a great story. Let's work on that. Let's lay that out. And then we just talked to him. All of us spent a lot of time talking to him, and it was very interesting actually because he sort of had the bones of the story, but the emotional heart of the story, which comes out in the episode, was not really there because he wasn't. You don't always spend that time thinking about your own life and
Processing your mom's thoughts.
And your mom, we
yeah.
talked to his mom and got all this insight. Again, it was sort of therapeutic for them to realize what they each thought about this experience.
Yeah, because it's interesting
now.
because he wrote the story from the perspective of his mom, not
He's
from the
in it.
perspective
Yeah.
of himself.
Yeah. But he's a character.
and he
character.
had-
He's a
Yeah.
character, but he's not the point of view character.
I highly recommend this as a form of family therapy, by the way.
Right.
Write
Me
a
too.
story.
Right.
Yeah.
You haven't
yeah.
now made
Right
a
here.
movie
Me
and
too.
a TV show about
Right.
it. Yeah.
Write your youth from the
keeps
perspective of your
happening.
parents.
But
You
yeah,
was-
and so working with Z was great on it because he wrote and directed it. But I think as you guys were mentioning, it helps to have this team around you, sort of to bounce those ideas off of and to refine what you have. So he had this script, and it got refined. I think eventually, and I went on that cruise with them to shoot that episode, and he had a script that was too long, so we helped him cut pages. And then we had, on shooting days, it was so funny because he comes from the world of kind of smaller independent film, and I was like, Z, you can shoot more takes. I was like, you can shoot more takes. We're using Uncle Tim Cook's money on this one. So, it's not, you're not maxing out your credit card, So it was really fun to sort of, as Emily mentioned, as someone who's worked on stuff with my own family or my own family stories, it was cool to see him doing the same and sort of processing that and help him along. And I think that episode turned out well.
Well, it's a wonderful episode and such a great example of telling the story of an immigrant's experience without feeling like you have to tell a huge story that represents everything. It's one small intimate piece of a person's life that because it becomes universal simply because of how intimate it is.
When you were asking earlier what was the hardest episode, I think in some ways that one was because of that very reason, which is when you have something where you're like, okay, well, there's going to be the big squash tournament at the end, or we know that the parents are going to return. And that one really is a story about there's no answer. It's just a woman takes her kids on a vacation. The kids want to hang out at the teen club. And at the end, she sees a glacier. You know what I mean? It's really
No
hard.
spoilers, Lee. She sees a
She
glacier.
sees the glacier.
A really beautiful description of the episode.
Yeah, but at the
But I think
moment,
a story
That's
that
the
size
haiku
is
version.
really hard to kind of come up with the truth, and there aren't big twists. and
It's
turns.
internal. It's very internal, too.
internal.
very
Yeah.
internal. So you're right. That's such a challenge as a screenwriter, right? Is you're used to writing stuff that shows action on screen. You want to see everything, drawn out visually. And for that one, you got to make her seeing a glacier as dynamic and sort of emotional and interesting and compelling as all of these other super cinematic events. And I think, Z pulled it off, and I think the whole team here pulled it off. But it was that
And the
shot
actress.
and Angela
Angela
Lynn,
Lynn.
who plays I, is that's an amazing shot. Her singing karaoke and then her looking at the glacier at the end. It's like that really pays off, in my opinion.
You know, Tom McCarthy is in it, but he's probably, and maybe I'm neglecting someone, but felt to me the most famous face.
Well,
Zach-
Melanie.
Zachary
Melanie
Quinto.
Melanie Laurent.
And
Yeah.
Zach
Zachary
Quinto.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who I saw walking on the way here.
You saw Zachary Quinto walking?
Yeah, I kind of tried to make eyes with him, and then he.
You tried to make eyes with him?
We know we've met.
We all have.
And he was creeped out? How
very
shocking.
handsome.
I kept looking. I kept searching for his eyes, and then I think that
You
was.
followed him and were like pushing
Yeah,
people
I was
out of
like,
the way to
"Ah,
get to him.
Zach."
Zachary, Mr.
We,
Spock.
we met once.
We
yeah.
met once.
But with the exception of that episode where you've put famous faces essentially in one episode, it
Right.
seems that you've intentionally not had famous cameos,
Well,
although you could have.
I mean,
throughout
we
it.
wanted to have, as Emily was saying, actors who were authentic to the characters they were playing. And the reality of Hollywood is that there aren't like super famous Ugandan actors or super famous Nigerian actors that we could use, you know. So it was just from necessity that happened. And obviously, it was a little bit harder to find these actors who sort of mainstream America doesn't know as well. But if anything, this show proves that there is a lot of talent that is completely untapped, and it's not impossible to find people who are
Can carry a full episode of television on their backs easily.
Yeah, and what a wonderful byproduct of the fact that by casting it authentically, we are launching people, I hope. You know, Confidence, who stars in the Cowboy episode right there, he is a star. And Journalist, who stars in the Jaguar episode, is a star. And Angela's a star. And so these people have never been number one on the call sheet. They've never been the lead of their own stories. And this is almost like a test balloon for them. You know, they do a half-hour episode. It's like, wow, that person's really good. I bet they could do a 90-minute.
and it's a lot. They do a lot in every episode.
It's
like,
it's
they're
insane.
really-
Being the lead is hard. Kumail, you know that.
Come here.
Yeah.
What's it like
Well,
to be the
okay.
lead?
Could you turn their mics off? I want to make a.
But I think even with all of those people, I mean, when we were casting the Iranian episode and the Syrian episode, those actors had played terrorists. I mean, if you look at their IMDb, it's just one of them was the terrorist, the big terrorist on Homeland. The other one was the one on Jack Ryan season 1. So to have a scene where they're just with their family and people are just sitting around the table and
They're not like
there's
planning
affection.
anything.
Yeah, exactly. There's nothing.
It's like yelling in the background with a group of other terrorists as they like run towards something.
Well, I know that for brown guys, it's always like if you're a little, if you're skinny, you're gonna play these types of parts, and if you're not, then you play the. There were like two. There's like either nerd, cab driver, 7-Eleven, or terrorist. You know, and I could never play the terrorist. I wish I could.
Till now.
Now I could play the fucking terrorist. Can I swear?
Yeah, you can swear.
Okay, great.
That's what you got the body for?
Yeah, to really just play terrorist number 3.
This is bullshit. I can fulfill the cliche of the stereotype of my community. God damn it.
Yeah, we've made a lot of advancements, maybe too many, and it's time to pull back a little bit.
I don't care about these advancements. I've always wanted to play a terrorist.
Yeah, it's been my dream.
Sorry. We have time for a few questions. Who has a question? Right here.
Hi. I was just wondering when you had to stray away from the. I mean, you kind of talked about it already, but when you had to stray from the real events and why you chose to do that.
There were a few reasons. I mean, I think sometimes you only have a half hour to tell the story, and so as you're kind of digging through it, there's in The Baker, the episode, the Ugandan woman who starts her own cookie shop. She had a boyfriend, and we broke the entire story with the boyfriend, and was really about this love story to go along with her opening the store. And we felt like, from a writing perspective, that our eyes were kind of going in two different ways, and we didn't know what we were supposed to invest in. Are we supposed to invest in this kind of romantic comedy about these two people finding each other, or are we investing in her pursuit of opening a store? And when we tried doing both, neither one really worked. And then we said, okay, well, what if we only really told the story about her and the boyfriend? But the most compelling thing when we first read that episode was, what a crazy thing that this woman from Uganda opens this incredibly successful cookie store, and the cookies were related to her father and the death of her father, and that was the memory, and that was the emotional core of that episode for us. So we kind of leaned into that. And then the other thing is we're compressing time. I mean, it's just hard in a half hour to tell all the scenes that you want to tell. So sometimes you're simplifying things, or you're creating a composite like the Tom McCarthy, the professor.
I think anyone's life could be a horror movie, could be a drama, could be a rom-com. Anybody's life could be any of these things, but you got to pick one. You can't make all the movies at once. You have to pick one kind of story to tell.
The other thing we cut out of the Beatrice's episode is that in real life, when she was making her cookies before she had the big shop, she would leave them out with the windows open and squirrels would come and eat them. And so
That's true.
This is true. And it was written in there that she was always battling these squirrels all the time. And she was like leaving powder all around the kitchen and trying to fight them off. And I was really fighting for these. I still miss the squirrels.
We couldn't get the budget for the squirrels.
It was
They're expensive.
millions of dollars of CGI for those squirrels. So would have bankrupted Apple.
We had the
entire
chipmunks.
company.
We had the,
I trained those squirrels for
Squirrel
months.
wranglers lined up.
But you write something like that, the squirrel thing, which was in draft after draft. Truly, it was
great.
It was woman versus squirrel, that classic
Because of
story
Josh.
told over and over again. No, but it was one of those things where you're in it and you're like, this feels silly, even though that's real. And
Speak for yourself.
It felt tonally off, and it also just felt like, well, can we tell the story without squirrels? These are the things you talk about late at night.
And Josh goes home and cries.
And then Josh writes squirrel fiction.
Did you have to stick to the 30-minute format? Was that part of it? I mean, because it is streaming, you can.
Yeah, we I
Wanted
mean,
to.
there's some are a little
34, 30,
yeah, but we wanted to stick to that in that range because I feel like that's the kind of it's a challenge, to be able to tell a story that efficiently that covers everything. And I find, especially with anthology movies, with anthology shows in this era where runtimes can be a little more flexible, I found with anthology shows when it gets a little shaggy, when it gets a little bit longer, the story's not as focused, and I sort of start losing interest. I think time constraints, any constraints are they're a challenge for the filmmakers, but they always end up helping, I think. So I think us sticking to that sort of around 32, 33-minute mark, even though it meant we couldn't have Josh's favorite squirrels in it, I think ultimately was very beneficial to the show.
Right. It's an absolute rarity that I say. I wish that was 30 minutes longer. Not. I wish.
We hear that a lot.
Yeah.
People are like, I wish it was longer. Like, that's what you want.
Even wanting more.
Yeah, people want more episodes. They want longer stories. We're like, yeah, it's just a snapshot of these people's lives,
I also think that the show is best experienced watching 2 in a row or 3 in a row because we're creating this tapestry of the United States. And when you see one episode, I mean, we spent hours and hours debating the order of the episodes. And when you kind of see one after the other, the breadth of it is exciting to us. So the fact that they're half hour and that it's not a big deal for someone to watch 2 in a row or 3 in a row, I think that's actually a benefit.
Yeah, I think the show is bigger than the sum of its parts. I think, and no one episode is representative of the show. And I think any 2 episodes would pair well together because they're all so different.
No one episode is, but I would argue that the overall tone of each episode is representative of the show. Like they're all different stories, but there is a tone to each episode that is very similar and binds them all. I think.
I think that's
true.
Yeah, I think it's a minor miracle that it ended because it really is because they are. If you look at the episodes one by one, are so different tonally. But I do think that there's a fundamental curiosity, empathy, and humanity to the stories, and that is something that we did, I think, prioritize. So I'm glad that that's coming across.
And I think the other thing too, it's not, when you write these stories, we've talked to a lot of people that have seen them now. We've been with audiences, and people get emotional a lot at the ends of the episodes. It's not like we're writing the ends of the episodes like, oh, this is a good cry moment. It's, you know what I mean? We're just trying to tell the episodes, and we want to tell them with honesty and oftentimes with hope or optimism, and sometimes with the fact that, regardless of the fact that he's reunited with his family, they lost 10 years of their life and they're never going to get that back, and let the audience sit in that for a moment. Or the fact that the end of the Syrian episode that he does find safety in some ways, but you see that he's still thinking about his father in those last moments. And so those are the things that we're always trying to come is like, where's the character where do we want to leave the character at the end of this?
2 more. Right here.
Oh man.
Hey guys, so Alan, I've been a big fan of yours for a while. I remember like jumping up and down when you won your Emmy in my living room. And so kind of looking at your career, it seems like it's been getting more and more specific, like from an NBC sitcom like Parks and Rec to then Master of None and now Little America and even Tiger Tail. And so I was wondering, how do you think about audience when you're taking on a new project, or like, do you even think about?
That's a great question.
That's a very insightful question, and I've got to say you reacted more to that Emmy win than my parents did, because I think they probably just stood there and said, "Oh, great." So appreciate the love.
Like, oh, some Asian guy won.
Yeah. It's actually a really good question, and actually we were talking about this earlier today. I think one aspect is that you just become more comfortable and more confident. You know, the more you work, the more you learn. You know, working on Parks and Rec, I learned from great writers, great directors, great actors, and then you start to figure out what you care about and what your point of view is and what your voice is. And so I think to answer your question, yes, I've become more and more specific because that's what I'm passionate about. And as you mentioned, you know, I just finished directing a movie called Tiger Tail, which is about my family, which is also about immigrants. Because
When's that coming out, by the way?
April 10th.
Okay.
April 10th on Netflix.
Oh,
Sorry,
come
Apple.
on.
But it really, you know, it's become, to me, the simple answer is this. What do you want to wake up in the morning and work on? And what are you going to be so insanely passionate about that you can't think about anything else? And that's honestly how I decide what I want to do. I'm lucky enough to be in a situation where I'm able to do that, and I think that's the stuff that's going to turn out the greatest for you. Because if you have that passion, if you have that drive, and you really, really cannot stop thinking about that idea, then that's the one you should work on. And I feel like that's gotten more and more hyper-specific and targeted as I've progressed in my career.
Can I ask a quick question? Yeah. Could you have made Tiger Tail 7 years ago?
Hell no. Hell no. It would,
right?
It's and I've changed as a person again, and that's really what's happened is working on Master of None and working on this show, and it's all sort of built up to this world where, I mean, a very simple way of putting it is, I didn't speak Mandarin growing up. I started learning Mandarin to direct this movie because the actors didn't speak English. So that's all happening. And I hadn't gone back to Taiwan since I was 7 years old. And then I went back to Taiwan with my dad, and the movie's about my dad growing up in Taiwan, and I shot the movie there.
But how long ago did you go back to Taiwan?
It took over 20 years before I went back to Taiwan.
I can't believe you started learning to speak Mandarin for your movie.
I
love this.
I can't believe you didn't force the actors to learn English.
But it was really funny because on set I had a translator, obviously, and I would sort of give notes, and then sometimes I heard my translator freelancing, and he would say, "Hey, for this scene, imagine it's the first time you guys have met." I was like, "No, you can't do that. We're wasting takes."
He wanted to be a director too.
Yeah, exactly. We're shooting on film. We can't waste it.
I want to make a movie about the making of Tiger Tail now.
It seriously was, really sort of, personal for me, and my dad. It's my dad's story, and he actually does the voiceover in Mandarin at the beginning and end of the movie.
Oh, that's amazing.
So it's, again, not to get on a sidetrack about that movie, but it is about immigrants, and it's part of the reason why we're so passionate about this show is, almost everyone working on the show is an immigrant themselves, or their parents were immigrants, or they're married to an immigrant, and it's really you can tell. I think you can tell how much we care about these stories because everyone put their heart and soul into them, and I think that comes across on screen. And we haven't had the chance to tell these stories before, is the other aspect of it. We talked about that again earlier today, where we haven't been the leads of stories, and these 8 people who get to be the leads of these stories, the actors mainly haven't been the leads, and so all of that is really, really, makes us feel good about the show and feel good about what we're doing with it.
I feel like, too, you work really hard so that you can get a platform so that then you can usher things into the world that are important to you. I think that's like, that not only could you have not made it personally maybe, but nobody was interested.
No one would have made that movie.
Exactly.
I can't believe it got made still.
Yeah.
It's still crazy.
I think that's what's great about working hard, even if it's not a thing that you're like, I have to do this, that you work hard to get the skills, to get the credibility, and then you let them have it.
Oh, one more?
Kumail, you're one of the only South Asians on TV. So to have to represent so many of us, is that a source of pressure for you?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Oh my God, what have I done? No, yeah, and I think it's unfair, not to me. I think it's unfair to the South Asian population that there should be many more people representing them, and hopefully that's changing because there's no one South Asian experience that mirrors the South Asian experience. My story is very different from every other South Asian person's story. So the more stories we have, the better representation we can have. That's what we wanted to do with this show, is show that, every immigrant has a completely different story. I'll see people being like, this is the Pakistani representation we have. He's not good looking enough or smart enough or talented enough. And I'm like, yeah, that's totally right. Get other people in here, Get other people. So yeah, I do feel that pressure, and hopefully as the industry becomes a little more inclusive, that pressure won't be on any one person or any small group of people.
Chris Pine doesn't feel that pressure.
Well,
Chris
he's
Evans.
representing all the white Chris's in the world, you know.
He's got other.
No,
there's
there
Chris
are
Evans.
them.
He's sharing it with
He
Thor.
splits it with 4
He's sharing it
others.
with Captain America.
I feel very represented by them, actually. So, guys, thank you so much for being here. Congratulations on the show. It's amazing, incredibly beautiful stuff. Is it on Apple TV Plus now, or is it coming
Yes.
this week? It's up
It's
now.
No,
been
it's
up
on.
for a week and a half, maybe.
week,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's on.
Up for a little.
It's out.
It's out.
I watched my screener, so I don't know.
Look at you.
For those of you who don't have screeners.
Yeah,
It's
watch it.
and if you have bought an Apple product in the last year, you get Apple TV Plus for free.
For a year.
I don't know why that's not more heavily advertised.
We're happy to do
but
it.
you get it for free for a year. So yeah, so just go sign up, you'll get it.
I'm looking for the Apple people to be. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's like a free trial too. You can sign up for a week.
Yeah,
You can
sign
watch
up
them
for a
all.
week,
It's
watch it in
half-hour
one night.
episodes. You can watch them all.
You guys to riff for 10 minutes about this.
We are the
10
brand
won't cover
ambassadors
it.
of Apple.
Thank you so much for being here. Little America's on Apple TV Plus right now. Everybody give them a huge round of applause. Thank you.